So from controversial reforms such as this and Obamacare to US foreign policy, just what will the president's legacy actually be? Joining us from our central London studio to discuss this, our former foreign policy advisor for George W. Bush, Mike McGann, and the chair of the official arm of the US Democratic Party in the UK, Rob Carolina. Rob, let's start with you. I mean, we rewind all the way to January 2009, and Barack Obama entered the White House on a wave of popular opinion. He was widely feted, won the Nobel Peace Prize shortly after that. Fast forward to this year, he's unpopular, he's hamstrung, and he's having to carry out his will through executive diktat.
Well, I think what we're seeing is a president, obviously, who's entered the last 2 years of his term. In terms of the legacy that he's producing from the time that he's entered office, I think there's quite a list of accomplishments there. I mean, saving the United States economy, saving the United States automobile industry, putting United States health care on a firmer and better footing than it's ever been over the course of the last half century. What we're seeing now is a shift into in this case, use of an executive order, which is something that has been done routinely, regularly by every president over the course of years. And President Obama has used this mechanism, relatively speaking, less often than almost anybody else in the last 100 years.
Still, Mike, you don't have to spend too much time watching the American rolling news channels to see that this granting of 5 million work permits isn't playing well with the Republicans. We heard there from John Boehner saying that they'll oppose him in the House, despite the fact that Obama wants to work with them. I mean, are we on the cusp of hearing that word impeachment yet again?
No, I mean, certainly the the Republicans here have a challenge, and they also have an opportunity. I think that the president, though, has taken quite a big risk. Most Americans, the polling that came out, about 48%, so almost half of Americans would have preferred that the president engaged with Congress on this in the legislative process. In fact, even the president himself, when speaking to the La Raza Foundation in 2011, said that he wouldn't do this by an executive order, that he would do this through the legislative process. So what you see now is politics. It's positioning for 2016. It's trying to garner the Hispanic vote. Yes, the Republicans do have a challenge on their hands, and what I think they can do is do the legislative process and basically send something to his desk.
Still, at the same time, and Rob, if you want to come in on this, if you take a step back from the frontline politics of it all and look at what President Obama has delivered in terms of healthcare reform and in terms of same-sex marriage, I mean, these will be policies which will reflect well on the Democratic Party in years to come. These will be policies which will be broadly welcomed by plenty of people within their target demographic.
Well, absolutely. And we're also seeing these policies welcomed more generally in the United States, particularly as the United States shifts its opinion on certain issues. You mentioned LGBT rights, same-sex marriage, the ending of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. These are significant policy breakthroughs, and they recognize a change in opinion amongst the American electorate. I mean, something that Speaker Boehner said in your piece leading up to this, I think, should be reflected on. He talked about the elected representatives of the people of the United States. What we can't forget is that the president himself is an elected representative of the people of the United States. He was elected to a second four-year term, and he's got 2 more years of that term to fulfill. He's just falling in the well-trod footsteps of people in this job before, including Republicans, including George H.W. Bush, who used a mechanism of executive order in a very similar way during his presidency.
Still, at the same time, Rob, looking at the last set of elections that we have to refer to, those Democrat candidates that actually proved successful, in the main, were ones which had distanced themselves from the president.
Neil, that's a great point, and I think you also have to see here that the Democrats just suffered their worst losses in the United States since the 1930s. So you really have to take into account here that the American people themselves, this applies to the president as well as to the majority now in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and they're saying, work together, do something. So for the president to wait until after the election and then do something by executive order is just another demonstration that he doesn't want to engage with Congress.
Actually, I want to agree with Mike about something there in particular, which is that the American people are frustrated, and what they're more frustrated with than the office of the White House, they're frustrated with Congress. The approval rating for Congress as an institution right now is at an all-time low of 10%. And that's just a terrible indictment of the lack of progress and lack of gridlock on Capitol Hill.
Right. And that's why they voted all the Democrats out. And they're giving other people a chance now.
Well, Mike, I mean, something that you pointed to earlier about the number of Americans who want the parties to work together for legislation, one of the people who wants that is President Obama himself, and he keeps calling for that. Now, when President Bush did something like this, the first President Bush did something like this in 1991, the Congress eventually stepped forward to turn that program into legislation. And the president has openly called for and asked the Republican leadership to work with the Democratic leadership to bring legislation forward, and I, for one, hope that will happen.
Yeah, I certainly hope it happens. I think this was a very risky move by the president, and it could be a very Pyrrhic victory for him.
Well, gentlemen, I think we can all agree that to an extent President Obama has been a divisive president. But I'll ask you for both, in one sentence. Rob first, your view of how President Obama will be viewed as a president when the history books do come time to be written.
Well, I think long after I'm gone, the history books will probably talk about, they'll talk about health care, they'll talk about the economic turmoil, and of course one of the points that the history books will talk about is the first African-American president in U.S. history. Not something the president ran on, not something that he necessarily wants to be remembered for, but for a while that will be one of the historical points.
Mike?
You know, it's hard to tell. I kind of agree with Rob here. You know, I think many people will say that there were many opportunities lost. But to be fair, we did have historic elections. There was a huge upswell when he was first elected. And I think what you've seen 6 years later is people saying, okay, we've had enough.
Mike McGann, Rob Caroline, thank you both for your time this afternoon.